Intramuros was the biggest European city in Asia. It defines our culture. The problem is most of our officials do not appreciate it.
It's important because it's part of our history, part of our heritage, and one of the few physical evidences remaining of the Spanish period of Philippine history.
There are many good stories about Filipinos, people who headed the construction of the walls. The carvers were Filipinos also. It was a very exciting time. That's what I remember most, having a restoration force as big as Intramuros was at the time. Well, didn't exist anywhere in the country. When we came into Intramuros to work, what are we restoring? We do not know. How did it look, except for the ruined walls? That's why we have to dig pictures and pictures and pictures just to be able to provide a background.
And in the early days, it was really a dead town. Even when Casa Manila was finished, we would make whatever pakulo just to bring in people.
The greatest satisfaction I had was the presence of a good team because basically the three of us were the ones who set the initial directions of the Intramuros administration.
Since last year, I'm really amazed at how Intramuros has grown and has attracted so many people considering the problems we had in the beginning. There have thousands of people coming here, and all of them are paying the entrance fees, restaurants, all those caletos. Can you imagine? It's alive.
You have many people saying that Intramuros should not be preserved because it is a colonial memory and that should be erased. I don't think so. So it's about time that our people should see Intramuros is not just a symbol of colonialization, but a symbol of our spirit to rise above that.
If there's something about Manila that hasn't changed ever since, it's the lovely sunrise and sunset, as if reminding us that in all the chaos, there's still beauty to find in this place we all call home. And moving around it every day, doing the things that we have to do, we completely forget the invaluable history that it holds and the endless possibilities it can achieve. As Intramuros administration celebrates its 40th year, we also celebrate its people. As we work together, inspire each other, and teach one another of the many ways why this city is a place we will always love to call home. Standing as one so that we never forget the past that taught us how to survive, so we can move forward with a strong heart to build a future that we can all be proud of. We are Intramuros.
Intramuros was the biggest European city in Asia. It defines our culture. The problem is most of our officials do not appreciate it.
It's important because it's part of our history, part of our heritage, and one of the few physical evidences remaining of the Spanish period of Philippine history.
There are many good stories about Filipinos, people who headed the construction of the walls. The carvers were Filipinos also. It was a very exciting time. That's what I remember most, having a restoration force as big as Intramuros was at the time. Didn't exist anywhere in the country. When we came into Intramuros to work, what are we restoring? We do not know. How did it look, except for the ruined walls? That's why we have to dig pictures and pictures and pictures just to be able to provide a background.
And in the early days, it was really a dead town. Even when Casa Manila was finished, we would make whatever pakulo just to bring in people.
The greatest satisfaction I had was the presence of a good team because basically the three of us were the ones who set the initial directions of the Intramuros administration.
Since last year, I'm really amazed at how Intramuros has grown and has attracted so many people, considering the problems we had in the beginning. They have thousands of people coming here, and all of them are paying entrance fees, restaurants, all those calesa. Can you imagine? It's alive.
You have many people saying that Intramuros should not be preserved because it is a colonial memory and that should be erased. I don't think so. So it's about time that our people should see Intramuros is not just a symbol of colonialization, but a symbol of our spirit to rise above that.
Intramuros for me is a place that tells you the story of Manila, the city that I was born in, the city that I worked in, and the city that I live in and will probably live in for the next years. My life with Intramuros began in 1999 when I started volunteering for a museum, Bahay Chinoy. And it was from there that I started doing cultural work, and eventually which led to us establishing our tour outfit in 2005. Intramuros is a place of a lot of personal memories for me because I've been coming here since I was a little boy. I remember my first trip here was in the 1980s when we had a school trip at San Agustin Museum. And I distinctly remember getting freaked out because I went to a crypt with lots of dead people, and which nobody really explained what they were. So that fascination with Manila's history, with my personal family's history, began here in Intramuros. I think what we do here in Intramuros introduces people to our city. And by introducing Intramuros to our visitors, we tell them the story and we make them understand the city, my city, Manila, what it was, how it is today, and what it will be in the future. My hopes for Intramuros is to be a place that is anchored in its past, but at the same time, it's a place that can have new ideas for the future. No? A place that will inspire people, a place that will create good memories, and a place that will make you feel good about being a Manileño. I'm Ivan Mandy. I'm a cultural guide from Old Manila Walks, and we have been doing historical walks around the old city since 2005. I see myself as a cultural worker and a storyteller. And I tell basically the story of our city. And the story of Manila begins here in Intramuros.
Every great and important city has an old town. Intramuros to me is Manila's old town. I have always been awed by Intramuros. It seems like when I'm coming here, there is an excitement that you feel that what happened in this place. There is something so sacred, so noble, so precious about Intramuros. I named it after my grandmother, Barbara, to just give it a Spanish flavor. And for some years, after a few years, we decided to really gear towards heritage so that people will see and know what is heritage, what is sinauna, yung kinaugalian natin, yung traditions natin, which will be seen in our cuisine and in our performances, in the dance that we present here in Barbara's. I would attribute it to my mom, to my mother, who taught me the value of work, the value of excellence, the value of feeding people in style and giving them satisfaction. I would want to happen that Intramuros will be remembered by every person who comes to this place because of its uniqueness, its sacredness, its history, its everything. There is so much here. I'm Barbara Gordon de los Reyes of Barbara's Heritage Restaurant. I have been in Intramuros for the past 30 years, which has been a great part of my work, my joys. It's like an adventure.
Welcome everyone to the Intramuros Administration's 8th episode of the Intramuros Learning Sessions. Our topic for today is about the informal housing in Intramuros by none other than Dr. Michael Pante of the Ateneo de Manila University. So this is our 8th episode of the Intramuros Learning Sessions, and if ever you missed any of our previous episodes, you may visit us at our official YouTube channel. You may copy this link, then go to our YouTube channel. Or, better yet, you may follow us. We are available via Facebook at Official Intramuros Administration, via Twitter at Intramuros, via Instagram, and we're also available. We also have our website. So if you want to know more about the Intramuros Administration, you may also visit our website. Also, for our Santo and antique enthusiasts out there, we are now available in Google Arts and Culture. Just search for the keyword Intramuros Administration. So the collection of the Museo de Intramuros is available for viewing piece by piece at Google Arts and Culture. So I see we have a lot of viewers and listeners for today. Hello, everyone. If ever you are watching via Facebook Live, you may share this webinar via our official hashtag #BRIntramuros. Before we start with Dr. Pante's talk, here are some reminders first. So here are some of our house rules. All participants will be muted during the webinar to avoid unnecessary interruption. If you would like to ask questions, you may send it through the Q&A button just found in the lower portion of the screen. Or if you are viewing via Facebook Live, you may also ask your questions via the comment section. Please turn off your video to help increase the quality of the call, and please use only one device during the webinar to avoid feedback. Certificates will be given to the first 100 registrants at least a week after the webinar. To claim, make sure to fill out the feedback form. The feedback form will be emailed to eligible participants. If you are unable to attend the webinar, please let us know so we can give the slot to another registrant. Okay, so may I now call on the administrator of Intramuros, Attorney Guillermo Asido, who will formally introduce to us our speaker for today. Administrator.
Good afternoon, everyone. We would like to welcome you all to the 8th learning session of Intramuros Administration. For today's guest, we have a very special, we have the privilege of having with us Professor Michael D. Pante. Professor Mike Pante is the Assistant Professor in the Department of History, School of Social Sciences in the Ateneo de Manila University. He is a Ph.D. holder. He is a graduate of the Kyoto University in 2017, MA in History, Ateneo de Manila University 2011, and he holds an AB Economics minor in History degree from Ateneo as well. He is currently teaching in the Department of History of Ateneo, and he is a published author of different works and holds several fellowships as well, and presently is the assistant editor of the Philippine Studies Historical and Ethnographic Viewpoints. He also has published different researches and presentations since 2016. So he also holds a number of honors and awards given by various local and international universities. So for today's session, we would like to welcome Professor Mike Pante.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to everyone in the Intramuros administration. In fact, one of the reasons why I came up with this topic was because of an invitation from the IA. I think this was in February 2020, so just a few months ago, pre ECQ Manila. There's a roundtable discussion on the master plan for Intramuros, and one of the points raised there was with regard to informal settlements, and that got my interest. And now I have a sort of preliminary study for this very important and yet neglected topic. Neglected mainly because we are always in awe of Intramuros, and rightfully so, given that Intramuros has a long history of colonial prestige and power. We are familiar with its magnificent buildings, its great architecture, but there are other important aspects of Intramuros that we rarely talk about, and I'm here to talk about one of those aspects, and that is, yes, informal housing in Intramuros. And I'd like to begin by pointing out a sort of gap in our discussion of Intramuros. We look at Intramuros often either in terms of its prestige during its might and power, its period of might and power in the Spanish colonial times, and also its, I could say, its lowest point during the Second World War, especially in the aftermath of the war, its destruction. So normally we look at those 2 points and we focus our attention there to the degree that we neglect a lot of other important aspects. And one of those aspects is informal settlements. And it's also kind of timely given that during this period of the ECQ, there have been a lot of discussions in social media, especially as to the so-called pasaway, squatter, yung mga ayaw pumasok ng bahay, manatili sa bahay. And you have a lot of stuff like that going on. And yet, we have a lot of literature. We have a sizable literature that talks about how informal settlements are a very integral part in the development of modern day society. We have Mike Davis talking about the planet of slums. We have even here locally. We don't have to go far. We don't have to go abroad. Paulo Alcazaren's Lungsod Squatter, looking at informal settlements from a different point of view, rather than look at them as a nuisance, as a problem. They actually have a lot of things to contribute to society. But these ideas haven't, I don't know, filtered down to public pedestrian discussion. So I hope to contribute to this discussion so that we can look at informal settlements with the more critical and with a more insightful vista. And of course, we have to begin with the origins of Intramuros. I would be tackling this point for a long time, but I just want to set the background. So the presence of slums in Intramuros is a huge irony given its origins as a space of dominance and wealth. Intramuros, which literally means within the walls in Latin, is not merely a colonial age defensive structure, but also a signifier of the power of the Spanish regime, conveying both impenetrability and racial exclusivity. Its walls, surrounded by a moat, form a 64-hectare pentagon-shaped space beside the Pasig River, which bisects Manila. The history of Intramuros can be traced back to the pre-Hispanic settlement of Maynila, which was occupied by Spanish conquistador Miguel Lopez de Legazpi in 1571, and eventually had the high walls and the surrounding moat during the term of Governor General Gomez Perez das Marinas. And by the 18th century, Manila was totally enclosed from the area outside as fortifications against various enemies, from Chinese corsairs to Dutch and British rivals, and this maintained the exclusivity of the city as an Iberian citadel. But by the 19th century, the surrounding arrabales, or the suburbs, developed due to the opening of Manila to international trade. The increasing importance of the arrabales led to a major socio-spatial shift. Now, Intramuros suffered a downturn in terms of human activity inside the walled city as the suburbs surrounding it became more vibrant. In the latter half of the 19th century, more and more colonial officials and Spanish residents in Manila preferred to establish their residences in the arrabales, including the Governor General himself, who moved his official residence to Malacanang, as we know, located in the suburb of San Miguel, outside the walls of Intramuros. And by the turn of the 20th century, Intramuros had become a quote-unquote lifeless capital, according to British observer John Forman. Although the walled city was practically untouched during the hostilities of the 1896 Philippine Revolution and the outbreak of the Philippine-American War, its gradual decay persisted after the turn of the century. Now, under the American colonial regime, instead of a swift, sudden death, Intramuros endured an agonizing, prolonged decline. In the first few decades of the 20th century, more and more establishments and support services built inside Intramuros began to move their operations outside the walls. Rather than occupy the walled city, wealthy Americans chose to establish residences in the suburbs, and you will see that in the numbers. So from in the first census of 1903, under the American regime, you still have 1,046 Americans in Intramuros, and that number declined year after year, leading to the last census in 1939, with only 102 Americans left in Intramuros, whereas down south in Ermita and Malate, you have a booming population of Americans just outside the walls. In terms of economic value, there was also a steep decline in terms of the value of buildings erected in Intramuros. And that drastic change was due not to any extreme economic downturn, but simply to the lack of economic activity inside the old district. The walls experienced alterations in the form of partial demolitions and the widening of pre-existing gates, as well as the construction of new ones to accommodate the influx of motorized transport modes in the form of the electric streetcar and the automobile. Moreover, in 1905, the moat was filled because it was already so polluted that it became a cause for public health concerns. There were even calls for the total demolition of the walls coming from the Municipal Council of Manila itself. The walled city was saved. However, when the new Burnham, you saw the picture from the previous slide, when Burnham pushed for its preservation as part of his 1905 Master Plan for Manila because of the wall's historic and archaeological significance, and because he viewed Intramuros as one of the few remaining samples of a medieval fortified town. And while Americans were going outside the walls, you have many Filipinos moving in. You have a constant influx of Filipinos establishing residences in Intramuros. Although this racial exclusivity coming from the Spanish colonial regime was already broken by the late Spanish colonial period, as you can see in the numbers, now more and more Filipinos were choosing to establish their residences inside the previously racially exclusive walled city. Now, Intramuros' decline worsened because of state neglect, as evidenced by the lack of an efficient mass housing policy to address the problem of homelessness. And this was coupled with this growing discourse regarding Intramuros as having no value for the American colonial state. While Intramuros contained mysteries as dark as the black robes of its religious, the brusque and the program style of rapid change American tourists is of no value for finding things in Intramuros, according to one tourist guide. It's symbolical of an order of things which is passing away. It's a symbol of the old relics of Spanish sovereignty. So given that even the Americans themselves paid no attention to Intramuros, gave no significant investments to Intramuros, it's not so surprising to see a decline matching with the growing population within Intramuros. And the end product there is a situation of housing congestion, considering the fact that in Manila and outside Manila, there was growing restlessness and as well as homelessness. By the late 1920s, the walled city had earned a reputation as a place of slums. As early as the 1920s, it already had a reputation as a place of slums. This issue was so pressing that even officials at the national level took notice. Even President Manuel Quezon, Vice President Osmeña, they were aware of the fact that in Intramuros, you already have this growing population of informal settlers. According to famed journalist Leon T. of the Philippines Free Press, it's not the rice fields of Central Luzon, but the slums of Manila, according to him, are the hardest on the tenants. Veritable coops of these houses, dark and dank accessorias. You have the city's great unwashed living in those dark and dank accessorias in Intramuros. So Intramuros no longer had the prestige it had once held. And this was before the Second World War. This was before the Japanese occupation. So what do we expect by the time the Japanese occupation hit and you had the devastation caused by the Second World War? The situation, of course, worsened for Intramuros. It no longer had the prestige that it had once held. And its destruction caused by the stubborn last resistance of the Japanese and the shelling done by the U.S. forces was the final nail in the coffin. And so what happens next? We often simply say, okay, Intramuros suffered a great deal after the war, but what were the details behind this destruction. Okay, we are all aware of the kind of suffering it endured, but what exactly was the kind of lifestyle, if you can call that, uh, of the residents who were still living in Intramuros? You have, in the first few years of Intramuros following the destruction of the Second World War, of course, a lot of destruction, a lot of despair. As we all know, historians of the Second World War regard Manila as the second most devastated city after the end of hostilities, next to Warsaw. The city was left in ruins, with the walls of Intramuros as one of the most visible pieces of evidence to show the level of destruction that the capital city had sustained. And practically all establishments within the old district, save for San Agustin Church, was a gray island in a sea of blackened ruins and piles of rubble, according to Jose Victor Torres. Unfortunately, Intramuros had to endure further suffering well after the end of the Japanese occupation in 1945. And so you have thousands of homeless already in Intramuros, and adding to that were huge numbers of homeless people coming from outside Intramuros moving in to the walled city. Thousands left homeless following the war. Manila, of course, faced a high housing crisis. And this produced an increase in the number of informal settlements in the city, compounded by an influx of rural migrants who were also fleeing a peasant uprising that erupted in central Luzon in 1946. Remember that right after the war, kakatapos lang ng gera, may isa na namang gera nangyayari. And this was the Hook Rebellion in provinces just outside Manila. So many of these peasants were fleeing the violence caused by the Hook uprising and the counterinsurgency. Where would these people live? Many of them lived in Manila, and a sizable portion of these people, finding themselves in Manila, lived in Intramuros. The representative image of that period was the type of shack called the barong-barong. This was the time when the term barong-barong became a household name. Okay, became part of the dictionary, so to speak, which came into being as an inevitable result of the war. A makeshift affair of broken slats, rusty galvanized iron, punched with machine gun bullets, flattened cans which once contained corned beef hash, soot blackened tarpaulins, and thin, mud-splattered posts picked up on the other side of an army compound. In fact, during this time, the Philippines Free Press named the barong-barong as one of the so-called representative icons of the 1940s, alongside American General Douglas MacArthur and wartime Philippine President Jose P. Laurel. The destruction caused by the war not only rendered thousands homeless, but also disrupted property relations. According to two housing experts, the sites marked for bombing and those chosen for squatting were often identical. And as you can see here in this particular photo, despite the fact that many of these buildings, practically all of these buildings, were bombed during the war, they were in fact turned into residential houses for many of these desperate citizens of Manila, such as this one near San Agustin Church, although it's not specific where this was in Intramuros. And in fact, many of these residents had to pay monthly rental. Given this level of destruction, it's quite puzzling for us to come to terms with it, but they were even paying rent. That's just how desperate the situation was at that time. So despite the level of destruction, there was an escalation of urban and suburban real estate prices. Many of the residents in Manila were, we should say, capitalizing on the level of desperation that thousands in Manila had. There were speculative practices of landowners, real estate companies with little government interference, thereby contributing to further homelessness among ordinary people. And of course, as I've said, Manila was one of those places that attracted the homeless. The walled city thus earned a reputation as a home of informal settlers, a dreadful squatter's hive. And that reputation endured even decades after the conclusion of the war. As you can see here, this is 1952. This is a photo taken in 1952, 6 years after the end of the war. And yet you have, according to Philemon Tutay of the Philippines Free Press, he called them modern cave dwellers. And these were squatters living inside the wall, literally in the walls of Intramuros. According to this photo, it was the wall facing the Pasig River. So the walls of Intramuros literally served as homes for many of these desperate residents of Manila. Many took advantage of the idle lots in Intramuros and the fact that it was a convenient location near places of employment and business. Many of these households occupied ruins left over from the Second World War, lived in barong-barong, they had built themselves, were, in fact, 33%, according to a survey, were originally from Central and Southern Luzon, comprising the biggest percentage among all other regions. And in contrast, only 2.4% claimed Manila as their hometown. I think one of the best sources for us to understand the level of desperation during the post-war years was this photo essay published in the Sunday Times magazine titled Intramuros Revisited. It was published in the Sunday Times magazine on November 26, 1950. As you can see in the subtitle of the photo essay, 5 years after its destruction, the walled city still remains a wasteland of talahib, ruins, rotted roads, and makeshift shanties. And I'll show you some of the photos I got from that photo essay. Unfortunately, many of those photos are of poor quality, given that these are old photos published in very old magazine. So this is according to the photo essay from the perspective of Manila City Hall. So I'm assuming that sort of thoroughfare there that you can see is Calle Victoria, I assume. And this was already 7 years after the conclusion of the war. You see some buildings here and there, but a lot of it is actually vacant land. In fact, you can see Manila Bay from that particular perspective. So these were attractive spaces for those who were in desperate need of a place to stay in Manila. Another photo from that photo essay is this photo, and I just like to read the caption presented in that photo essay. This is a photo of Letran. And the caption says, "Today, Letran holds regular night and day classes in its 4-story rejuvenated building. The school has a large enrollment in spite of the absence of the many good boarding houses that abounded in its vicinity before the war. What mars this Intramuros scene is the presence of rubble and rotted streets that are impassable. There is also the unsightly shanties and the long lines of laundry." So yun talaga yung una lang mga nakikita. Yung shanties at yung mga mahahabang sampayan ng mga nakatira doon sa mga shanties na yon. They hang in the vacant lots behind the school, and most of these ramshackle dwellings, according to the caption, gouged out of the thick Intramuros walls, were paradoxically absent 3 or 4 years ago when they should have been many then. At that time, the housing problem was most critical. So what it says here, according to the photo essay, was that 3 or 4 years ago, so around 1949, wala pa itong mga shanties na ito. Diba? And you would think these shanties would mushroom during the first few years of the conclusion of the war. But according to them, 7 years after the conclusion, in fact, lalo pa nga dumadami. The numbers of these informal settlers kept on increasing, and for them, it proved quite a nuisance, supposedly marring the view of Letran. Another photo I'd like to share is this photo. Again, yun naman yung mga sampayan. Gusto lagay pakita nila yung mga nakasampay na damit. For me, it's kind of symbolic of Intramuros hanging on. Okay? Nakakapit na lang ang Intramuros. Parang yung mga sampay nung mga informal settlers doon, o yung damo, yung lumot doon sa mga bato. Talagang kumakapit na lang. Kumakapit na lang talaga kung saan po pwedeng kumapit ang Intramuros given the level of destruction it endured during these early post-war years. Now, despite ejection orders, it was talagang marami na sila. They were in the thousands at that time. And because they were already being seen as a nuisance, government saw the need, especially the local government, saw the need to intervene. And there were many ejection orders at that time. But despite all those ejection orders, many of them managed to stay. And their story of survival in the walled city can be seen as a feat in and of itself, given that Manila's local government in the post-war period had a very negative view toward the urban poor. And one of those people who had a really negative view of the urban poor in Intramuros was famed mayor, Manila Mayor Arsenio Lacson. And I mean, Arsenio Lacson is Arsenio Lacson, probably the most popular of all Manila mayors in history. The original Yorme, you could say. Unfortunately for our Mayor Arsenio Lacson, for him, slum dwellers were a hazard. And I would like to quote from one of his reports, not only a hazard, not only to the morality, but also to the health and lives of members of the community. Therefore, they had to go. For Lacson, these informal settlers in Intramuros, they had to go. So, beginning in 1951, in fact, Lacson forced squatters living not just in Intramuros, but in Port area, Nagtahan, Malate, forcing many of them to move to Quezon City, which was already declared the capital city in 1948. Unfortunately, the specific relocation site in Quezon City was 13 kilometers away from Intramuros. And during that time, 13 kilometers was a significant distance, given that there were no reliable transportation services then. At ngayon, nakikita natin sa ECQ yan, di ba? Kapag may kotse, kapag may public transport, 13 kilometers is, well, nothing. Pero kung wala, and during that time, wala nga talagang maayos ang public transportation, for these informal settlers in Manila, including Intramuros, to be moved to Bago Bantay in Quezon City, this is in North EDSA, it was a blow to the ability of living in the city, given that they were far from work. It was practically a rural location that could not support city-oriented inhabitants. There were no basic utilities, tubig, kuryente, and for Lacson, parang okay, sige, umalis kayo, parang tratong basahan. Ang nangyari sa kanila. And yet, these slum dwellers had to make do with what they were given. They were still people. Okay? We still have to recognize them as people. They were still having their own fiestas, making their celebrations, as you can see here in this photo. Kind of interesting because it's rare that you see informal settlers being treated with humanity in newspaper articles at that time. So you see them here enjoying their time, and there were around 800 plus dwellers coming from Manila, including Intramuros, that were transferred to this particular resettlement site in Bago Bantay. So this photo essay was already taken in Bago Bantay when they were already relocated. But that didn't stop informal settlers from mushrooming again and again and again in Intramuros. As you can see here, in an article by Esteban Paredes, published in the Philippines Free Press, December of 1956. In fact, the title was "Squatter Problem in Manila." The problem was still there, despite Lacson's iron fist approach to the problem of informal settlements. There were still squatters in Intramuros. In fact, you have here a photo of children being taught by a priest, volunteer social workers, who quote-unquote had to be protected from their vile environment. Another interesting photo here, this one from an article by C.V. Pedroche, published in the Chronicle magazine of July 13, 1963. So this was already a year after Arsenio Lacson's term as Manila Mayor. Lacson, despite him being Arsenio Lacson, couldn't solve, quote unquote, solve the informal settlement problem. In this particular photo in Pedroche's article, you see it's the Manila Cathedral, and then beside it, in fact, practically surrounding it are informal settlements, makeshift shanties, all over Intramuros. And Lacson's successor at the Manila City Hall more or less did the same thing. And that was Mayor Antonio Villegas, who served as mayor from 1962 to 1971. And in one of those infamous evictions that happened in December 1963, Villegas ordered the demolition of shanties of around 4,000 Intramuros residents. Although according to a study conducted by Dwyer in 1976, it's a conservative estimate. He looks at around 11,000 affected informal settlers in Intramuros. Ganun karami informal settlements at that time. And it was infamous because of the manner it was conducted, forcing these informal settlers to move even further away. And that was in Sapang Palay. So kung nung panahon na yon, Bago Bantay was a rural, distant rural area with no basic utilities, what more kung sa Sapang Palay sa Bulacan. And the manner it was conducted was, just really violent. The slums were demolished. People were not even given a chance to pack up. These were done despite the fact that the Sapang Palay community had no necessary utilities and amenities. According to a newspaper article, Villegas got all the available army trucks, even garbage trucks, in order to haul all of those informal settlers. So parang basura. Almost like parang basura yung tutol yung turing sa kanila. And so this was the quote unquote hasty uprooting of thousands of squatters from Tondo in Intramuros. So there. But with that, in fact, bababa yung number. So after Villegas's infamous eviction in 1963, you see a big decrease in the number of squatters, according to a report conducted by the Office of the President itself, titled "Squatting and Slum Dwelling in Metro Manila," a special committee report published in 1968. There were only 73 squatters, according to them. So you see a huge drop in the number of informal settlers as a result of Villegas's campaign. But did it stop the presence? Did it actually eliminate the presence of informal settlers? Not really, because as we shall see, by the time that the Marcos administration came about, parang ganun din. Okay, and I'm showing you the old logo of the Intramuros administration. But this was a crucial change, given the fact that Intramuros administration was given special jurisdiction on Intramuros. It was crucial because before the establishment of IA, Intramuros was under the direct supervision of the city of Manila, since it was part of the city. But with Marcos's creation of IA, now there was another layer of administration. And in fact, the city mayor from the Marcos era to the present couldn't simply have their way in Intramuros without consulting the IA. But did evictions stop during Marcos's time? Not really. In fact, nagpatuloy din yun. Although, ang nangyari ay dumami during Marcos's time, despite the fact that there was massive restoration, as we all know, during Marcos's time in the IA as a result of Presidential Decree 1616. dadami pa rin yan. And up to now, at present day, IA, we still see the same quote-unquote problem of informal settlements. Even after Marcos was ousted in 1986, Intramuros failed to shed its notorious reputation for its huge colony of illegal settlers. In fact, in a 1991 survey, the population of Intramuros was around 60,000, and supposedly 7,500, or more than 10% of the local population, were illegal residents. And then in an editorial published in year 2000, in Malaya, let me just quote from that editorial, blight galore, squatter colonies where thousands of people live in subhuman conditions, mini smoky mountains, day and night on empty lots, sidewalks turned into funeral wake sites, the pavement and half of streets turned into open markets, pedicab terminals, wrecking yards, junk yards that passing vehicles could hardly avoid. So this editorial shows you that contemporary urban planners and heritage advocates continue to view the presence of illegal settlers as a nuisance. And there were a lot of legal suits, countersuits, especially given the fact that they were being deemed as a desecration of valuable spaces in the walled city. Because a lot of them are in fact, and these are the present day photos of Intramuros along Calle Victoria. So you have old buildings like this turned into to spaces para mixed residential and commercial buildings. It's still a situation we have to face. And unfortunately, a lot of the heritage studies concerning the preservation of Intramuros as a historical site do not even mention the persistent presence of poor settlers. Although, of course, none of this is to say that in the past decade, it has been searching for ways to fulfill its mandate while addressing the housing concerns of residents under its jurisdiction. But for example, in 2012, it partnered with Gawad Kalinga to continuously push for the rehabilitation and preservation of the historical value of Intramuros that would benefit more than 3,400 informal settler families living within its walls. But the project aimed to educate, quote unquote, educate the residents on the importance of Intramuros as a heritage site, and in return, provide them with decent homes and livelihood. Unfortunately, it's more or less window dressing without really looking at the deeply rooted solution to the problem. And more or less, it was because it was largely a relocation plan. The rationale was that the removal of their shanties would lead to increased foreign tourist arrivals in Intramuros. And the first relocation site was Trece Matres in Cavite, more than 40 kilometers away from the walled city. As reported in 2012, many residents were still reluctant to move because their homes in Intramuros were near their places of work and their children's schools. According to a resident, Leopoldo Toston, 72 years old, who's a pedicab driver, there's no work over there in the relocation site in Trece Martires, and we just go hungry. The only thing important to us, we're on our own if we give up the lot in Intramuros. And although the first batch of relocated settlers moved in 2013, still a significant number of families still occupy parts of the walled city. In fact, ayun nga, marami pa rin mga discussions, conflict. You also have to consider the fact that despite the fact that yung Manila mayor has to consult with the IA, it becomes a more complex. Maybe IA can shed light on how this is being resolved in light of the bureaucratic complexities involving local and national government units. But to drive home my final point for this presentation, heritage conservation is important. However, a myopic understanding of historic sites as places of consumption can also be ruinous. If the walls of Intramuros are treated as ruins from a sort of mummified past, and not connected to the present, then we would end up committing a grave error against people who are very much still living and breathing as we speak. Certainly, it would be a false dilemma to pit heritage against the socio-economic needs of a group of people. Instead, one must view these factors not as individualized facets that need to be given their relative weights, but as part of a coherent whole. Who defines what heritage is, and what about the people who are not in a position to define heritage vis-a-vis spaces for economic or household reproduction? We look at them as as a nuisance, but how can they be a nuisance given the fact that they provide important services for Intramuros? You have to consider the fact that they provide transportation services such as yung pedicab services. I'm sure many of them are being employed as employees in the various tourist destinations in Intramuros, whether as waiters, waitresses, tour guides, and what have you. And when I say our, I mean the middle class who are invested in heritage. Our involvement in heritage, our means of enjoying it, it won't be possible without the hard labor, in fact, the cheap labor, I should say, of these informal settlers still living in Intramuros. So, I mean, we cannot simply look at them as a nuisance that should be simply relocated elsewhere, and thereby removing, simply put, the problem. And I'd like to look at to show you a book from a scholar, Wataru Kusaka, Moral Politics in the Philippines, because it provides a new perspective, I think, for us, because it allows us to see ourselves, look at ourselves in the mirror, and see na may mga ibang perspectives din, especially the perspectives of the urban poor. And I would like to stress that heritage conservation, therefore, is not just an advocacy issue, but also a particular social discourse. The subject of the power imbalance between those who define the parameters of the discourse and those who are defined by it. And one should therefore not lose sight of the fact that for the most part, this discourse stems from middle class sensitivities. Appeals to a sense of history and national patrimony are often deployed to trump what are deemed to be the individualistic interest of informal settlers. This conundrum mirrors what Wataru Kusaka has definitely analyzed with regard to the polarized public sphere that separates the urban poor and the so-called civic-minded middle class. Kusaka asserts in the civic sphere, highly educated members of the middle class would lament that Filipino politics was forever doomed because the poor in their ignorance was easily duped by corrupt politicians and celebrity candidates. And I think maybe we should go beyond that kind of mentality whenever we speak of heritage. And I would like to end by stressing that it's interesting to note how the residents themselves perceive the concept of heritage. For sure, they have their own definition of culture, their definition of heritage. And for me personally, it is encouraging to note that the IA at present is striving to answer this question. In a roundtable discussion organized on Feb 11, 2020, to consult with stakeholders, the IA presented its proposed conservation management plan. And one of the most important points in that plan was the recognition not only of the fact that informal settlers play an integral role in the community, but also of the need to revisit the previous resettlement approach in light of this newfound appreciation for the whole city's low-income residents. Because the low-income residents are part of what makes Intramuros a living organism. Without these actual breathing residents, Intramuros would be a fossil of a heritage site. And so further research, especially of the empirical kind, is needed to flesh out how the residents of Intramuros view concepts like heritage. And thus, it is not far-fetched to think that the very people who live in Intramuros, who drive pedicabs, sell trinkets, manage parking lots, in essence, people who keep tourism in Intramuros alive, they also have their own definitions of what constitutes heritage. The question now is, will the middle class be open-minded in listening to them? I think that's all for my presentation, I would like to get your comments and questions if you have. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Mike, for that very wonderful presentation. I see that we have a lot of viewers today. In fact, this is our episode with the most number of Zoom attendance turnout. So let's see. So we have a lot today. I see we have here Lou Revilla. Hi, Lou. I see that we also have the former administrator of Intramuros who is watching with us today. Hi, Attorney Marco. Hello po. And hello, everyone. We are now opening our open forum for Dr. Pante. May I call on again the administrator of Intramuros because we anticipate a lot of questions that only IA can answer. And I would like to remind everyone that if you would like to raise questions, you may send it to the Q&A button below in your Zoom screen, or if you are viewing via FB Live, you may also raise your questions via the comment section. Okay, so our first question, I think, can be answered by Dr. Pante. So this is from RJ Punong Bayan. Sir, Intramuros complex, as far as I know, contains 5 barangay units. These barangay units has considerable number of residents now. Is it safe to say that they are legitimate tenants or occupants of the walled city? If in the past 10 years of Manila mayors in the 70s, they had been keen on relocating these families, then why would we end up today with residents living inside the walled city?
Okay. Well, I think I'm not in a position to say whether a certain household or individual is a legitimate resident. There are legal considerations regarding that. But as to the question, given the fact that there are persistent campaigns to relocate, but still they're there, the simple answer is that the situation in Intramuros is no different from the other cases. We have a lot of informal settler communities outside Intramuros. We have in Tondo, we have that in Pasay, all over Metro Manila. And the persistent answer is this: there's simply no opportunities in the relocation sites. I think the reason why they are here in these places near the urban centers, it's a very simple answer. This is where you find economic opportunities. This is where you find access to education, for example, access to Medicare, for instance. It's like trying to ask bakit ba alis ang mga Pilipino papuntang ibang bansa para maging OFW. Ganun din yung sagot dun eh. Diba? Nasa ibang bansa yung trabaho, walang trabaho sa Pilipinas. So if you use that understand that in a micro scale or in a national scale, ganun yung mangyayari. There's a geographical imbalance in terms of opportunities in Metro Manila and outside Metro Manila. So despite the fact that you have numerous eviction campaigns from the term of Arsenio Lacson to Mayor Villegas up to the present, it won't change anything because they would simply go back to their previous places because they need to feed their families. They need to earn a decent income, something that they won't earn in Trece Martires, or mahihirapan sila. Even in Cavite, in Bulacan, considering na medyo mayayaman ng mga probinsya mga ito, but Metro Manila is still Metro Manila. So I think that's a simple answer to that question. But as to the legitimacy of their residents, of course, it would be a case-to-case basis na yan. And there are legal considerations for that.
Thank you, sir. We have a lot of questions today. It seems that a lot of people are very interested in our topic. Okay, so may I also remind everyone that if you have a specific person in mind you'd like to ask, like if you want the question to be addressed to our speaker, or if you want to address your question to the administrator of Intramuros, please do so. Our next question, I think, can be answered by attorney. In your opinion, why does people? I sorry, there was a question. Is the park beside Plaza San Luis, where plenty of informal settlers are still there, still under IA or City of Manila? What will be the plan of IA or the City of Manila regarding the problem of informal settlers in Intramuros? So I think he's referring to the property behind the Casablanca.
Yes. So in response to the question of whether or not the community is still there, the person who's asking is referring to the community known in Intramuros as the Maisan and the Plastican compound area. So they are still there, and the property is actually owned by not by government but by a private property owner. So this matter on the informal settlers inside Intramuros has long been a tedious issue. So this has dragged on for the past several administrations already. But fortunate for us, we were able to inherit a program from the past administration that would require for a more simplified or more inclusive approach to to the problem of the informal settlers. So we're not looking at it simply from the perspective of eviction. We are looking at basically also from the perspective of looking at it from the perspective of inclusiveness. So while we are addressing the issue or the concerns regarding the informal settlers, we recognize the fact that they are part of the community. And in recognizing that they are in fact members of the community, we recognize that they, as Professor Mike said, they are working there, they had children there, and they practically grew up already in Intramuros. So what our intention is basically, while we are addressing the problem of the informal settlers, we would like to retool them as well and to prepare them for more practical programs. So in fact, just before the pandemic, the first pedicab drivers were duly accredited by the Department of Tourism as community tour guides. So there were 19 of them, and in fact, the mayor himself recognized that they are community tour guides based already in Intramuros. So, anong maganda dito? The beauty of this program is that the government basically recognized that they are part of the community. So, in terms of the informal settlers naman, there's a bigger program that is in place already. And we are doing this in partnership with the National Housing Socialized Housing Finance Corporation, SHAPC. We have signed an agreement with SHAPC, and we also signed an agreement already with one of the private property owners. So that is in fact a recognition. So hindi lang siya mere eviction. This is basically a voluntary approach of addressing the informal settlers. So by saying that it's inclusive, communities basically involved in the process of where they would like to be moved. Okay? So hindi lang siya mere eviction through court orders. What we want is an inclusive process.
Thank you, sir. Our next question is from John Paul Abellera. For administrator, I think. What can be done to make the residences of informal settlers safer places to live in given the COVID-19 crisis?
You will be surprised actually, and I think based on the records naman, that regularly is being given out, the lowest number of cases in Manila is actually inside Intramuros. To date, there are only 2 positive cases of infection. But according to the contact tracing that has been done so far, these were not all community. These were not community acquired. Ironically, they were acquired inside while these patients were inside the hospital already. So Um, what this pandemic basically revealed as well is that the informal settlers and the community acted as one. Okay? So even before the enhanced community quarantine was implemented, there was a considerable movement already in terms of recognizing that the communities, the different barangays inside Intramuros should work as one. So because of that recognition, I think yung aspect of implementing the quarantine process was more safer, was more facilitated. So that I think led to the conclusion that there are low number of cases right now inside Intramuros.
Thank you, sir. Uh, Dr. Pante, this is a question from Edgar Ibanez. How can we balance heritage conservation and the economic needs of informal settlers?
Well, I think IA is in a better position to answer that. But if you ask me, my very personal opinion, yeah, there are ways to balance it. One is recognizing the fact that they are many of these informal settlers are contributors to to the to the life of Intramuros. As I've mentioned, hindi naman po pwedeng parang fossil yung tingin natin sa Intramuros, sa parang okay, building, church, diba? For a historic site to be truly significant to people, it must have quote unquote living organisms living in it. So I think it begins with the recognition that there's a community, or there are communities in Intramuros. They have their own fiestas. They have their own sources of livelihood, and many of these sources of livelihood are based there in Intramuros. So I think it should be taken as parang holistic approach, much like what we're doing with COVID-19 pandemic. Diba? I mean, we recognize the fact that we cannot tackle the COVID-19 pandemic na one track mind lang tayo. Diba? Yes, we need a medical led kind of approach because this is a pandemic. But maraming naapektuhan na sa transportation, maraming maapektuhan sa nawalan trabaho, maraming maapektuhan sa pagkain. So if you look at the approach, almost practically all cabinet secretaries are involved in the response. And I think the problem, if you can call it a problem, with informal settlements in Intramuros, given that it has been persistent, it has a long history in itself, we need a comprehensive solution as well. It's not just socio-economic. May din political concerns nga rin dyan. Yun nga, given the bureaucratic overlaps, City of Manila, and the national administration through IA. You also have to consider public works, yung basic infrastructure, and things like that. So siguro depende rin yan at the level of households, depende rin yan kasi may kanya-kanya rin silang mga trabaho. So and then again, as us na wala tayo sa loob ng Intramuros, better patronage, I think, diba? If we can make Intramuros sustainable through our continued patronage, then I mean, diba, tayo na mismo ang tutulong doon sa livelihood ng mga taong naninirahan sa loob ng Intramuros. So marami. I mean, very general concepts lang naiisip ko, but I'm sure IA already has a comprehensive plan in mind.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Pante, in your opinion, why do people from other provinces want to settle in urban areas such as Manila, as evident in Intramuros, aside from economic reasons? So are there any reasons aside from the economic?
Aside from economic, I think meron ding iba, but more or less it's simply economic. The one reason I think na not so economic would be security concerns. If you look at the history of informal settlements in Intramuros, one of the key push factors, you should say, of that rural to urban migration was insurgency. There were surveys conducted, and a huge portion of the informal settlements in Manila in the early post-war years were from central and southern Luzon, and was the common denominator there. These were the areas of insurgency during the Hope Rebellion. And I think isa rin yun sa mga push factors. Marami, hindi lang talaga economic kasi kailangan na lumikas, probably from the Marawi situation, the Mindanao situation, marami rin ibang lugar pupunta dito sa Maynila. But mainly it's economics, di ba? Kasi if you are in a place and you are stable there, if you have a family there, why bother uprooting yourself and moving elsewhere kung meron ka namang basic needs doon? And the problem is, yun na nga, even their basic necessities aren't met in their present situation, and that leads them to move to other places where they could get better opportunities.
Maraming salamat po. Ang susunod na katanungan ay galing kay Chen Ramos. Anong mga batis ang maaaring gamitin sa mga ganitong uri ng pagsasa sa kasaysayan? Lalo't na mga informal settlers ay kadalasan ay hindi napapansin at mahirap din silang matrace. At lalo't minsan ay hindi sila nagtatagal sa isang lugar.
I think yung kung batis sa pag-uusapan, yung mga tao pa rin mismo ang pinakamagandang batis kung tayo ay nag-aaral ng kasaysayan ng mga komunidad sa Intramuros. Marami naman doon sa mga nakatira rin sa Intramuros ay may mahaba ng karanasan doon. Siguro may mga kwento-kwento, kwentong bayan, sabi nga natin sa kasaysayan. Maaari rin siguro puntahan yung mga nakatira sa Sapang Palay kasi nga marami doon sa mga na-evict noong 1960s sa Sapang Palay sila na-relocate ng panahon ni Mayor Villegas. Although syempre, na yon, magiging malaking research project na yan na para kang DOH na magko-contact tracing, punta ka sa Sapang Palay, hahanapin mo yung mga pinakamatatandang residente doon, tatanungin mo sino po dito yung mga original na relocate dito ng 1960s. Duda ako na mahahanap po pa yung mga na-relocate sa Bago Bantay nung time ni Mayor Lacson. Malamang wala na sila doon. Pero more or less yung mga taga na Sapang Palay, marami yata sa kanila nandoon pa. But yun ay para sa mga pasalitang batis, oral sources in English. But in terms of written documents, mga nakasulat na batis, hindi ganoon karami. Kaya kung inyong napansin doon sa aking presentasyon kanina, halos lahat ng mga pinakita kong batis ay mga galing sa mga pahayagan, journalistic in nature. So, Philippines Free Press, Chronicle Magazine, Sunday Times Magazine, at marami yan. Nakakatuwa na hindi masyado napapansin, lalo na doon sa mga nag-aaral ng kasaysayan, doon sa pagitan ng World War II at ng martial law period, napakaraming dyaryo na sumulpot ng mga panahon ito. At nagkukumpetensya talaga sila sa isa't isa. At ang agaganda ng mga nilalabas ng mga artikulo. Yun na, may mga photo essays nga as early as 1950s on Intramuros. So these written documents can be used as sources. Marami ka na makukuha from there. Hindi pa ako nakakapunta sa IA, unfortunately. I heard maganda ang library at holdings ng IA. Unfortunately, hindi pa ako nagkakaroon ng oras para pumunta doon to consult it directly. Baka meron baka meron kayong masasabi about the holdings of IA, especially written documents to be used as historical sources. But yun yung share ko. Oral documentation, oral stories from the residents themselves or former residents who have been relocated, and the wide array of newspapers and magazines in the post-war decades. Napakarami na. Ang ganda-gandang source ng mga pahayag niya.
Maraming salamat po. Attorney, our next question is from Dennis Cebollena. Over the years, several attempts to relocate the informal settlers of Intramuros have failed or has not yet materialized. Do you think that it is now time to explore private-public partnerships projects to redevelop Intramuros as the prime historic quarter of the Philippines?
Definitely. Kasi ang naging problema nga na tingin namin to sa implementasyon ng informal settlement problem is that walang framework na tinitignan. When we came in, we basically had a program already, yung strategic initiative for mainstreaming of people's lives. But aside from that, ang gusto sana namin, magkaroon ng proper international framework. So that's why we adopted yung UNESCO Urban Heritage Landscape Approach. Ang nakalagay doon sa approach na yon is that you recognize that Intramuros is a living community. Okay? As sinasabi nga ni Professor Mike, it should not be seen as a fossil. Okay? It's a living community. Merong mga nakatira dito, whether they be formal or informal, and marami here are also doing their business. And if you look at the profile of the informal settlers, they are not in a way your usual informal settlers. Okay, dahil most of them have been living inside Intramuros for the longest time, and most of them are really working inside the district as well. And most of them have been able to, in a way, move from their current conditions na nakapag-aral sila ng mga anak nila, and that they were able to do so successfully. So, iba ang profiling ng mga informal settlers sa loob ng Intramuros. So, in terms of the approach, well, we now have the UNESCO Urban Heritage Landscape Approach. We also decided that the best way also is to identify the proper perspective, yung lagay mo na sa kabuuan. So that's why we had the Conservation Management Plan of Intramuros. So sa Conservation Management Plan of Intramuros, we identify the value of Intramuros and how it affects the various stakeholders. So it was a tedious process in a way dahil tinignan namin kung ano ang value ng Intramuros not just for us in the national government but also to the local community themselves. So they were properly consulted and how they see really the value of Intramuros. So in terms of approach, binago namin in terms of how it should be implemented. Okay, so hindi lang siya, katulad na sinasabi ko, na eviction. What we wanted is an approach where we have dialogues with the property owners. Okay? And then we have dialogues also with the informal settlers. Sa kauna-unahang yatang pagkakataon, sa isang community na pinapilot namin ito, nagkaharap yung may-ari ng lupa, okay? Yung informal settlers, and then with us also. And all of us agreed on a common timeline of implementing the program. So magagawa nyo lang to kung lahat kayo nag-uusap-usap. And that's what we've been trying to do as well. Espouse a common dialogue with all of the stakeholders concerning the informal settlers inside Intramuros.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Pante, how many of the post-war squatters or informal settlers were part of the Intramuros squatting or informal settling community pre-war? Given the issue of slums was noted by the Americans in the 1920s, did the post-war people from inside the walls before 1941 to 45 simply return to where they once lived?
mahirap na i-trace yun. Kasi, first of all, there is very little to none documentation regarding informal settlements in the pre-war period. Not just for Intramuros, but for all over the Philippines. What we have are general statements. Gaano sila karami, where exactly do they live. But in terms of a formal survey na sino sila, anong mga pangalan nila, their occupations, I haven't encountered any kind of source from the pre-war period that gives you that kind of level of detail. Actually, even in the post-war period up to the Marcos era, you don't see that kind of attention to detail. Kasi yun nga I think part of the problem there is that ang turing sa kanila dumi na kinakailangang walisin. So, 'di ba? Given that kind of mentality, wala ka nang pakialam kung ano mga pangalan nila, sino ba sila, ano mga trabaho nila. Gusto mo lang silang bilangin at siguraduhin na mapapaalis sila. So it's hard. I think practically it's impossible for us to trace whether the people who live in Intramuros in the pre-war era were more or less the same people from living there in the post-war era. Although if we are to use as a sort of clue yung isang binanggit ko kanina about the shanties in Letran, apparently, yun nga, even 5 years, 7 years after the conclusion of the war, rather than their numbers decrease, dumadami pa sila. In areas where there were none, okay, areas where there were no informal settlements, 1950s, early 1950s, dumadami pa sila. So that leads you to a hypothesis na marami sa mga yun in the 1950s were quote-unquote not originally from Intramuros. But to give you a definitive answer based on actual hard evidence, unfortunately, we don't have that kind of historical data.
Thank you, sir. Attorney, our next question is from Maria Regina Zaguirre. During tours in Intramuros, iniiwasan ko yung squatter area. Thus, hindi na iikot ng buo yung Intramuros and hindi nakikita yung mga heritage buildings dun sa area na yun, like those near Letran. Your insights on this. Thank you.
Depende kung sino yung nag-guide din eh. Kasi I've seen some tour guides as well na dinadala talaga dun sa informal settlers na area. And I think they're including it as part of the tour as well. And I've seen some tourists as well go to those areas. I think kung ang tanong kung dapat ba ito o hindi, tingin ko dapat kasi it's a recognition that there is a living community inside the district. Okay? Dapat tignan din siya na gano'n. And that kung madalas sinasabi nga that Intramuros is a microcosm of the country. So kung titingin mo sa kanila, hindi sila part of the community, mahirap din ganitong pananaw. Okay? But so far, okay, I think ang approach na katulad ng sinasabi namin is to make sure that all of this will be considered as part of an inclusive program. Okay? Kasi if you do not use that approach, it will always be a parang process na naghahabulan lagi which is more tedious at counterproductive towards the full redevelopment of Intramuros.
Thank you, sir. Our next question is from Marcos Tardillo. Professor, thank you for the presentations. 2 questions. First, it was interesting to see the ebbs, tides, and flows of the informal settlers settlements in Intramuros pre-Intramuros administration or 1979. Have you looked at the current community profile? And if you can comment on the lineage of the incumbent residents. Second, I appreciate the tensions noted by Watara Kusaka and in your closing remarks. Have you looked at the perceptions and attitudes of people towards informal settlers over the years. For example, unfortunately, campaigns waged by political leaders such as Lacson and Villegas would resonate with the public even today. And it takes political support for such campaigns to be mounted to begin with. Thank you.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, I haven't conducted any kind of oral history interview with the residents. What I have done so far is to look at periodicals, newspapers published during the early post-war years. Siguro if given the time, given the opportunity, I can do something more comprehensive, do something more in-depth, and talk to the residents themselves. Kasi yun ang tingin ko yung pinaka-importante. I mean, we can talk all we want about how we want to make Intramuros more inclusive, but for so long as they are not part of the discussion, parang medyo baliwala rin. So we really need to talk with them, to have them part of the conversation. Now, as to the second part of that question, actually ganun din. Parang yun nga it's really hard to parang we really have to recognize na yung campaigns nila Lacson and Villegas during that time, they were actually supported by the middle class, and that's the reason why they are regarded as two of the best mayors in the history of Manila, because the reasoning behind that was they were supposedly true to the rule of law, 'di ba? Pinapatupad nila yung batas. Hindi sila namimili ng boto ng mga informal settlers despite their huge numbers. But I think we also need to reconsider this kind of discourse as well. I understand we are living in this period na parang we are being critical of populism, of politicians, parang just simply catering to what is popular to a huge section of the population, despite, di ba, these policies being detrimental to society as a whole. But then again, medyo konting hilay-hilay rin siguro tayo when it comes to being anti-populist. Because, I mean, diba, there are certain measures that are populist because they are, well, really popular, diba? And they are popular because they cater and they will give positive results to a huge part of the population. Diba? So, I think we need to temper our anti-populism. I mean, we do have to be critical of populism, certainly. And I'm part of that. But we do need to temper that anti-populism sentiment, especially among the middle class. Temper it with a critical recognition na, sandali, baka naman talaga may mga nakikinabang dito na they're not part of our quote-unquote circles. So parang ano nga siya parang it's I mean, history is simply this, ang paulit-ulit ng mga bagay-bagay. Yung nangyari ng panahon nila Lacson and Villegas in the 1950s, 1960s, it's still being repeated today. Many of the middle class who supported Lacson and Villegas, their justification in supporting those evictions are more or less the same justifications you have among the middle class today in supporting and sometimes even denouncing in social media. Yung nga, nabanggit ko at the start of my presentation, diba, we are often too uncritical when it comes to the pasaway, squatter, yung mga, I remember during the early days of the ECQ, yung mga lumabas, kasi may supposedly meron daw relief goods. Pero I mean, if you are in their position, di ba? I mean, mag-iiba talaga ang iyong frame of mind when you are put there in that kind of economic desperation. And we need to always reconsider, to always interrogate, di ba? Our middle class position. Yeah.
Thank you, sir. Our next question is for attorney. Uh, were the original settlers inside Intramuros given orientations regarding the importance of valuing their surroundings and how to preserve them for themselves as current income and their future generation? Also, Agnes Miguel asks, can these people be trained as storytellers of the place, especially those who were there way, way back?
I cannot answer kung yung original settlers eh. But what I can respond to is the present situation. So right now, actually, dahil nga sa proseso ng pagdadialogo na ginagawa namin, ini-involve namin yung community. That's why we recognize yung mga, like for example, yung basic principle na yung mga pedicabs doing the tours themselves. Okay, so 19 of them were already trained by the Department of Tourism as community tour guides. So that's a significant development. Dahil they were able to comply with the requirements of the DOT and to be accredited as community tour guides. Now, yung sa question as well, kung involved sila dun sa proseso ng pagpapahalaga sa Intramuros, actually yun ang pinaka-principal objective namin eh. We want the people who are living inside the district to be recognized as the primary protectors and as the primary beneficiaries of Intramuros. I think ito rin yung maganda rin nangyari during this pandemic eh. Dahil nakita nila, in a way, na nagsasabi sa akin nga that the walls protected them from the pandemic. This may be a perception to many of them. But I think nakita nila, in a way, symbolically siguro, yung value of living inside the walled city. Now, aside from that, we try to make them also be part of the process. Like, for example, looking at it from the perspective of the vendors naman, yung vendors, for example, were all organized already. At in a way, nilagay na namin sila sa tamang pwesto. If you visit Intramuros right now, bihira ka na lang makikita ng mga vendors actually in the plazas, in the streets, dahil we recognize them that they should really be part of the community and they should be given proper spaces. Okay, so yung mga public areas na hindi naman walang tao or hindi naman, I think, namin accessible to the public as well, doon namin nilagay yung mga vendors as well. So that's a recognition of the community as well. Now, ang kagandahan din dito, when we were working with the community, we involved the barangays as well. Tama kayo na 5 ang barangay sa loob ng Intramuros. 5, pero lahat yung kinakausap isa-isa. Lahat yung kinakausap din collectively. Para at least lahat ng approaches nga will be more inclusive at singular yung lahat ng ginagawang programa.
Okay, sir. The next question is from John Alton Chua at Dr. Pante. Under the American period or during the Commonwealth period, was there urban planning or simply place the community in a better settlement if not within the wall? Were there even titled legitimate Intramuros residents back then? Okay, to translate the question, I think he's asking if there were land titles back then. Yeah, and if there was urban planning inside Intramuros back then.
Yeah, of course, when it comes to urban planning during the American period, you have to go back to Daniel Burnham. His 1905 master plan included Intramuros. In fact, were it not for Daniel Burnham's efforts, it was certainly possible na magtibag yung mga pader. Because a lot of the Americans, even the Filipino officials themselves, many of them were of the opinion na masyado na luma yung mga pader na yan, it's a relic of the Spanish colonial past, dapat tibagin na yung mga yan. Diba? We don't need reminders of our previous colonial past. But Daniel Burnham was firm in his belief that these walls are needed in order to preserve the Spanish colonial identity of Manila. Although hindi naman yun yung naging sentro ng kanyang plan, but the center of his plan was the area outside, right outside Manila, which was Luneta. And this was the nucleus of his plan, and everything, the street layout, it radiated from the Luneta and the neoclassical buildings that were put there. Unfortunately, maganda yung plano, but I mean, Pilipinas to eh, di ba? So sa Pilipinas, maraming magandang plano, maraming magandang batas, pero yung implementation yung kulang eh. So Burnham's plan was, to say the least, partially, actually parang ano na nga yun eh, very kind word na yung partially implemented. Only a small portion of Burnham's plan was implemented. And I think a huge part of this was also due the lack of implementation was also due to the fluctuations in the colonial government in the years that followed. Because we have to remember, after Daniel Burnham, that was 1905, in the succeeding decades, Filipino officials grew, their participation in administration grew as well. So in fact, aabot yan, but by the time that the colonial period, commonwealth period, you already had a president in Malacanang, a Filipino president in the person of Manuel Quezon sitting there. So may mga ano na rin yun, may mga tensions na rin yun between what the Filipino politicians wanted and what the 1905 master plan had in mind. Eh, syempre, diba, pag bago na yung nakaupo, iba yung gusto niyang mangyari, and that applied to Manuel Quezon. Marami rin siyang gusto mangyari. In fact, yun na nga, kaya nga tayo nagkaroon ng Quezon City, mainly because he wanted to do something original na hindi niya kinakailangan sumunod doon sa sinasabi ni Daniel Burnham. So, yun yung situation. I mean, hindi ganoon ka-significant yung mga urban plans that were, I mean, the 1905 urban plan, because hindi naman yun yung focal point ng urban plan ni Daniel Burnham. Although it had a significant role in preserving the walls of Intramuros. As for the titling of the land, we have to bear in mind that Intramuros is not one chunk of land na iisa lang ang gobyerno na nagmamay-ari. As already mentioned in the Q&A, may mga private space din yan. Spaces owned by the church, spaces owned by private entities, businesses, public spaces as well, definitely. So, and may mga titles naman yan. I mean, by the time naman na dumating ng mga Amerikano, there was already a more or less systematic titling of land. And there were residents, Filipino residents who were not informal residents. Okay? They already had their houses there. Yung iba nga nagpaparenta na ng mga bahay, accessorias. So you had these people, just like what you see in Binondo or in Santa Cruz, accessorias, residences on the second floor, and then businesses on the first floor, na hindi pa informal settlements. And with the legal title that went along with it. So iba-iba rin yun. I mean, hindi naman isang malaking tipak lang ng lupa yung Intramuros. So but certainly may land titling na nangyayari.
Thank you, sir. For the administrator, has the Intramuros administration considered turning the informal settlers into permanent residents, even if they are given a choice to relocate or not? If their source of income is inside the Intramuros, why not help them to legal residence, legal assistance inside the whole city instead? If not, why? And did the Intramuros administration have already tied up with social enterprises with regards to livelihood of settlers. Ariel Panadero asks, other than relocating the informal settlers outside Intramuros, do you think there are other solutions that can be considered where the informal settlers will be part of the inclusive urban development? And lastly, for Flor Capadusa, is it a band-aid solution to just design the residential houses of informal settlers to blend with the aesthetics of the walled city?
Maraming katanungan yun ah. Una yung sa tanong dun sa whether we've considered already them to be permanent. Actually, isa sa yun sa mga approaches. When we say na maging inclusive yung approach, ang sinasabi namin basically is that it will be the choice of the informal settlers as well kung saan sila ilalagay. Okay? So this is one of the, I think, unique features of the program that we are implementing. So dahil na rin sa proseso na ginagawa to, dahil sa approach na to, okay, pinag-uusapan ito along with the private property owners themselves as well. Okay. So if eventually they decide kung papayag naman yung property owner, let's see kung ano magiging resultant ng discussions as well. Okay. Now, dun sa question regarding dun sa social enterprises, actually yes. Okay. We have partnered with PBSP. We have also right now partnered also with Escuela Taller. Ang Escuela Taller is a Spanish government-funded program on retooling of yung mga out-of-school youths. Now, they are located inside Intramuros, pero yung una namin katanungan actually sa Escuela Taller is bakit walang pumapasok from inside Intramuros, particularly from the informal settlers sa Escuela Taller. So that's why when we decided to work with them, at nakasama na dito ang mga informal settlers inside Intramuros. So every year, pagka naghahanap na ng bagong batch ang Escuela Taller, part of the process as well is to invite already community members inside. And in fact, meron na mga ilang nakagraduate from Escuela Taller who are actually residents of Intramuros. Now, dun sa question on the aesthetic, actually, ito yung isang malaking problema na nakita rin namin. There can be an approach where you just implement a common design. Okay? But there can also be an approach na you look at it from the proper perspective. Nung tinignan namin yung rules and regulations ng Intramuros administration, nakita namin na mayroong mga bagay doon that needs to be clarified as well. Okay, so instead of just us issuing in design guidelines, so to speak, or mandate everyone to follow this particular design, what we wanted to ensure is that there be proper perspective. Kaya ang unang-una namin ginawa nga ay yung conservation management plan. Pagka nagawa yung conservation management plan, susunod na doon yung pag-identify naman on how should people really value Intramuros. Okay? Marami ng mga uniqueness of design sa loob ng Intramuros eh. Unfortunately, merong nakalagay sa batas na merong konting subject to different interpretations and subject to interpretations ng mga nasa Intramuros administration. Yun ang iniiwasan na namin ngayon. Okay? Na maging subjective in terms of interpretation of the various rules. So, pagkatapos na gawa na namin yung conservation management plan, at after this, we will move on already to a discussion regarding the urban identity design guidelines.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Pante, we still have a lot of questions coming in as we speak. Is it okay if we still continue with this or?
Sure, no problem.
Sige po. Okay, so our next question is from Christopher Pasion. Do some of the families that live in the informal houses in Intramuros have some sort of oral history documentation? Curious if certain informal settler families that moved in right after the war have some documentation. Migration stories reveal so much material on the social history of the area.
Yeah, more or less answered. I have answered that previously. Unfortunately, yun nga, hindi pa. So I intend to do a more comprehensive and direct oral history approach. Talk to at Intramuros residents, but yun na nga, as of now, what I have are simply documented, written documentation coming from published sources. So wala pa akong oral history, but hopefully, pag may oras na and pag nakalabas na tayo ng mga bahay natin, we can conduct oral history
Thank you, sir.
surveys.
This one is from Nina Racela. So she said that this may be a little bit off topic, but do you have information about, was there any form of informal settlement during the earlier years of Spanish colonial period, or specifically she stated here, during the British occupation of Manila? So was there any cases?
Grabe. Talagang throwback na throwback, British occupation of Manila. Well, I'm guessing wala pang informal settlements nung panahon ng British occupation, given that that was in the 1700s, 1760s to be more precise. And it was still more or less exclusively Spanish walled city. So I'm guessing there were no informal settlers there. Well, with the definition of informal settlers na alam natin ngayon, more or less, the racial exclusivity of it was maintained. But in terms of sources, there are sources, the usual Blair and Robertson documentation. You also have eyewitness accounts of the participants, William Dampier, if I remember it correctly, and a lot of other eyewitness accounts to provide you with first-hand descriptions of what happened to Manila during the British occupation. But I'm more or less certain wala pang informal settlers sa loob ng Intramuros at that time.
Thank you, sir. What are your thoughts on the future of Intramuros and its position in Philippine history vis-a-vis the future of its informal settlers? Would be interested to know what you think would be the ideal turnout that would be most beneficial to the cause of heritage preservation while being able to protect the rights of the informal settlers.
Yeah, I think it's there are a lot of possibilities, especially moving forward. In terms of collecting the stories. And yun na nga, maganda na marami nagtatanong about getting oral history interviews, documentation ng mga lineage, ng mga families. Because this is a new and a very promising direction in heritage conservation. Diba? Kasi madalas nakakulong rin tayo sa concept of heritage conservation as something tangible. When in fact, a huge part of the heritage conservation deals with the intangibles. So, paano yung pamumuhay ng mga tao dati? Diba? Who were the members of their community? What were their stories? What were their inside jokes? Well, total, mahilig naman tayo mangopya sa Singapore for some reason. Why not look at Singapore as an example? In Singapore, kung iisipin mo, parang hindi ganoon kalaki yung opportunity for heritage conservation given that maliit yung spasyo nila, and then parang may constant redevelopment, buildings being torn down, new buildings being put up. But actually, in some of their residences, yung mga original high-rise HDB flats nila, yung Housing Development Board flats nila, na parang pag-iisipin mo, tinignan mo, okay, so condominium na napaka squarish, mga maliliit na kwarto na may mga pamilya doon. But given the long history, at least 5 decades, yung mga earliest nila, Queenstown, for example, now there's a movement among Singaporeans, heritage advocates there, to collect stories. So who were these people or who were originally moved to places like Queenstown? Na pag inisip natin yan, parang ano ba yan? May mga nakatira sa mga condominium na parang mga box ng karton ng sapatos, ganyan. But it is part of our heritage. Diba? tao sila na nagkaroon ng kwento, nagkaroon ng buhay, nagkapamilya, nagkaanak. And we need to preserve their stories. So looking at that, moving forward for Intramuros, I mean, why don't we collect these stories of settlers living in Intramuros? We already have documentation from the early post-war years. Why not combine that, the written documentation, with their oral history, and then package it as part of, di ba, heritage conservation na intangible heritage. I mean, kailangan siguro rin nating isipin, i-redefine our concept of what is historic. Di ba? Kasi madalas, we take it for granted that what we deem as historic is essentially yung mga naiwan ng mga taong makapangyarihan at may say sa buhay. Di ba? So yung Palacio del Gobernador, San Agustin Church, Manila Cathedral, because these were the tangible legacies left behind by the people in power. Maybe today, moving forward, we ought to redefine what heritage means. Bakit hindi kasali doon sa heritage yung mga naiwan ng mga karaniwang tao? Diba? Why can't we consider, for example, a 50-year-old, I don't know, barong-barong in Intramuros, diba? As part of our heritage conservation, why should we put more premium on a 50-year-old house na maayos vis-a-vis a 50-year-old barong-barong? Diba? So, it's a matter of widening our horizons, being more creative, being more imaginative as we move forward. Papunta dito nga sa issue ng heritage and Intramuros.
Thank you, sir. For Attorney Asido, this one is from Joe Casella. Any plan for on-site housing for informal settlers, complete with social services? So this one, she is asking if for complete social services. This would avoid the resistance of many when we try to relocate them. Also, from Maria Anatolio, for the IA, sir, do you think including the area of the informal settlers in Intramuros, so I'm reading this verbatimly, do you think including the area of informal settlers in Intramuros tour permanently will be beneficial? I tried to explore the area several times and there are still a lot of really old buildings but medyo nakakatakot na mag-ikot. Either the residents are outside, nakatambay, or no tao at all. Thank you.
Okay. I think yung unang katanungan is basically, have we considered as well on-site? Yes, we consider that as well. But ang problema is that question of space as well. Okay, so in order for us to consider any on-site, dapat pag-usapan ito as well with the property owners. So isa ito sa mga learnings that we are now trying to consider as well and discuss with the property owners themselves. Okay, but this will only happen if yung dalawang stakeholders that are concerned, the property owner and the informal community themselves, will commit to this process mangyari o itong discussion na to. Now, dun sa other question pertaining to the old structures inside na may mga informal settlers, ang madalas kasi it's more of an impression eh. Okay? I was able to go inside dito sa mga informal communities by myself. And nakita ko doon that actually wala ka naman dapat katakutan eh. Okay? Everyone recognizes the fact, lalo na sa loob ng Intramuros, that ang bumubuhay sa distrito are tourists. And now, more than ever, I think, recognize nila that if something happens to a tourist or a visitor, apektado lahat. Okay? So, with that kind of perspective in mind, naintindihan nila na kung gaano kahalaga ang mga turista, gaano kahalaga ang mga visitors inside ng Intramuros, they're more considerate and they're more protective of what they have right now. Actually, sinasabi ko nga sa mga residents ng Intramuros whether they be formal or informal, it's actually a great privilege on their end to be living inside the district. So dapat pahalagan nila to. Okay? They should value the privilege of being inside the walled city of Intramuros.
Thank you, sir. Uh, for Dr. Pante, this is from Ariel Panadero. Uh, are there any places, local or international, facing the same situation of Intramuros having informal settlers in today in heritage or cultural sites? And how did they approach the situation?
I think it's a global phenomenon. Here in the Philippines, I can't think of some place that pwede na siguro natin i-compare with Intramuros. Although you have places in other places in Manila. For example, if Binondo can be considered a parang Intramuros na historic district, and within Binondo you also have this kind of informal settlements, di ba? I'm not sure if there's an entity there doing something as comprehensive as IA, kasi parang wala naman yatang ganun for Binondo. But I mean, just look at how thriving Binondo is. Or for example, I think Escolta. There are initiatives in Escolta that want to sort of revive the tourism scene there, but without without resorting to evictions, demolitions. In fact, taking advantage of the situation na okay, may mga lugar dyan na vacated, may mga lugar na medyo sira-sira na, pwede natin ayusin, and we can turn that into something na pwede maging hip, 'di ba? May mga tourist draws naman na ang gusto nila, ayaw nila yung masyadong malinis, 'di ba? Gusto nila may gritty yung dating. I've been there to Escolta once, and I think maganda siyang pang-akit, especially among the millennial generation who are also willing to quote unquote invest in tourism. And outside the Philippines, yes, it's a global phenomenon at maraming ang ganyan na parang there's a sort of competition between heritage conservation and the economic situation of informal settlements. Rangoon, for example, is one of those illustrative cases, mainly because Myanmar in recent years has been opening to tourists na parang for the past few decades parang wala masyadong pakialam ng mga tao. So ang daming mga magagandang colonial era buildings in Rangoon na parang walang pakialam yung mga tao kasi yun nga, hindi siya nag-generate ng tourist income. So binahayan ng mga informal settlers. Pero ngayon na naging mas maluwag yung gobyerno and tourist arrivals are now becoming more apparent, biglang meron ng ganitong klaseng war on informal settlers. So parang, 'di ba, nakakaloko din na parang, 'di ba, nung walang dumarating ng mga turista, wala kayong pakialam sa amin kasi ngayon na marami na pwedeng pagkakitaan, bigla niyo palalayasin. So what we're facing in Intramuros, this kind of situation, it's not something na tayo lang ang nakakaranas. Marami pang iba, and we can learn a lot from other places. Nga, nabanggit ko nga, Singapore example. We ought to look at heritage as, diba, not simply the tangible stuff, not simply the buildings, the architecture, but the stories of the people. And diba, what better way to recognize the historic significance of the settlements in Intramuros? What better way than putting their stories as part of that intangible heritage?
Thank you, sir. We are down to our last two questions. This one is for Attorney Sido. This one is asking for the rough estimate on siguro, sir, on the employment profile of informal settlers in Intramuros, like what were their livelihoods?
Okay. Yeah.
And are there plans to link their livelihoods to major tourism enterprises or institutions in the area?
In profiling, actually, I think the last profile that was done was in 2015 or 16. Makikita doon na basically they are all dependent on on the business inside Intramuros. So many of them also have their own sources of employment. So nagtatrabaho rin marami sa kanila inside sa mga businesses establishments inside Intramuros or just outside of the district. Ngayon, there are, ang talagang nakikita namin value talaga dito is that they should really be part of the bigger process of being the main sources of personnel for establishments inside the district. Pero magagawa lang yun if they're properly, their skills are properly retooled already. Okay? So that's what we're trying to do right now. Itong nangyaring pandemic gives us an opportunity as well to look at their skills right now. Okay? Not, they should not really be just, tingin lang nila is that they should be pedicabs forever, drivers forever. But tignan natin kung saan sila pwedeng ilagay sa mas mga ibang establishments also where they can serve or do something else na mas productive as well.
Thank you, sir. And for our last question for today, this one is from an anonymous attendee. The post-war reconstruction and rehabilitation of Intramuros is largely reflective of the post-war reconstruction and rehabilitation of the city of Manila. It were temporary band-aid solutions that were created from just after the war seemingly have turned out to be permanent ones we still employ to this day, 70 years after the war. Of course, this is due to the complications brought on by numerous factors and compounded over the years. What do you think should have been done right at the very beginning, granted there were ideal conditions then to allow it?
Quite interestingly, medyo pareho yung sitwasyon na kinakaharap natin ngayon in the immediate post-war period. Because we have to remember, one of the main reasons that allowed us to reconstruct our cities, our settlements, was because of the post-war payments given to us by the United States. At malaking halaga ng pera yun. Problem is, you would be given post-war payments kung meron kang enough clout, meron kang enough stature. So, institutions like, for example, UP, nakakuha yan ng war damage reparations. One of the reasons why nakapaglipat sila sa Diliman, from Ermita to Diliman, malaking pera doon ang galing sa war damage payments. So, for example, yung Quezon Hall, it's actually the funding for that came from war damage payments. Other big institutions, my institution, Ateneo, for example, got money from it, and of course, other government institutions. Yun nga, ang problema, kung ordinaryong Juan de la Cruz ka, hindi ka makakakuha ng pera para ibangon mo ang iyong sarili pagkatapos kang mawasak ng isang malaking digmaan. So, why is it something similar to our situation? Siguro parang in this pandemic na badly needed ng ordinaryong tao yung pera. I think it's the best way is by giving the ordinary people the money for them to rehabilitate themselves. Kasi dahil nga sila ay lubos na nangangailangan, eventually yung pera na ibibigay ng gobyerno, it would circulate back into to the economy. So in the process, habang tinutulungan ng tao yung kanyang sarili na mag-improve, 'Di ba? At the same time, nagsisirculate yung pera doon sa ekonomiya, rather than it being stuck in the hands of a few wealthy and well-connected institutions na magiging savings na parang sige, itabi muna natin just in case kakailanganin natin. Whereas itong mga mahihirap na nangangailangan, right there, and then bibili yan ng pagkain, bibili yan ng papababay ng tubig, etc. So I think siguro if the question is all about ano dapat yung ginawa right from the very start, I think that's one. Ensuring na sana nabigay yung pera doon sa talagang mga nangangailangan na tao. And that included those thousands of families who had no houses whatsoever. Nagkasya na sila dun sa mga literal na pader ng Intramuros para lang magkaroon ng bahay. Kung nabigyan sila ng pera para makabili ng maayos na kahoy, maayos na yero, nakabili sana ng nagkaroon sana sila ng matinong bahay, hindi sila kinakailangan maging informal settlers, and yung binili nilang kahoy at yero, iikot yan, may kikitang hardware, may kikitang karpintero, and the economy would be jump-started once again. Kumbaga back to normal. Another situation, another possible solution, I think, na mga what-if scenario na nagawa rin sana, would be a more equitable distribution of resources. I mean, that kind of a devastating situation, wartime situation, distribution and redistribution of resources should have been foremost in the minds of people. Kasi yun nga if you redistribute, for example, reallocate land, and at that time, meron ng huge disparity between the haves and the have-nots. If there was significant economic reallocation of resources para magkaroon naman ng sapat na pera yung mga tao para makapag reconstruct right after the war, then siguro, 'di ba, hindi natin kinakailangan umabot sa punto na may mga taong kailangan mabuhay sa barong-baro at mas disenteng pamumuhay. Kasi 'di ba, wala naman sigurong taong gustong tumira sa hindi maayos na lugar, 'di ba? Ang problema lang, wala sila sapat na pera eh. 'Di ba? Kung bibigyan ka ng pera, gusto mo pa na tumira sa hindi maayos na lugar. Problema, wala silang pera, so they have to make do with whatever they had. And at that time, walang-wala talaga sila. So, tatayo silang barong-barong doon sa Intramuros. So, I think those two would probably yung mga what-if scenarios na sana, kung yun ang nagawa. Reallocation of funding from yung war payment, war reparations payment of the US directed to the masses, and the opportunity to redistribute resources, land, actually even spaces, public spaces, could have done a lot para mas naging maayos yung sitwasyon. Hindi natin kinakailangan magkaroon ng mga informal settlers because they would be self-sustaining. These households will be self-sustaining. They wouldn't need to live in makeshift houses.
All right, that was our last questions for today. And if you have more questions for our speaker, you can email him via mpante@ateneo.edu. So you can email him at mpante@ateneo.edu. And who would you like to be our next guest in our next episode? Please tell us about it. So you can email us at research@intramuros.gov.ph, or you can also contact us via also another email to research@intramuros.gov.ph via Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or YouTube. And before we end this, Dr. Pante, do you have some final words, if ever? So, the words just to wrap up.
I just want to thank IA for the opportunity and everyone who listened. I hope you, learned a few things about the history of informal settlers in Intramuros. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Uh, for those who have missed this session or who came in late, you can view this session. So we're going to upload this later. So you can view this session at our YouTube channel. So just go to our YouTube page via the link provided in the screen. So if you want to share, please use our official hashtag, we are Intramuros. So thank you, everyone. This is the Intramuros learning session. Till next time, bye-bye.
Thank you, Professor Mike.